Hello, welcome. We're happy to see you. On behalf of the College of Education and Dean Fredrickson and the National Center on Quality Teaching and Learning, funded by the Office of Head Start, I'd like to welcome you this evening to the 2013 Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is Susan Sandahl, and I'm the director of the National Center on Quality Teaching and Learning. This year, we got an early start. We started about a month ago, and now we're moving into a series of lectures on science, technology, and mathematics and young children, and we're really excited to get this going and to learn some new things and to think about some new ideas. And some of us will be in a position to apply that new knowledge almost immediately. Excuse me, this evening we're really excited to welcome Dr. Bill Penuel, who comes to us from the University of Colorado at Boulder. He is a professor in educational psychology and learning sciences. He earned his PhD from Clark University, and he was a researcher at SRI International for several years before moving to Boulder. Bill has a deep interest in teaching and learning, including teacher development, and also the organizational processes that are needed to support teaching and learning. And he combines those interests with the study of young children's learning, especially in science, and the place of digital media, and then we're going to learn much more about that tonight. I should say that NCQTL is delighted that Bill is one of the partners on our center, and he has helped us tremendously in the area of course development, in science, thinking about approaches to learning, and he has really been quite helpful in the development of a technology-enhanced tool that we call the Coaching Companion. And he'll touch on that just a little bit tonight, I think. But really, what he's here tonight to help us think about is enhancing learning with digital media in early childhood. So, Bill.
So a special thank you to Susan, to Gail Joseph, and Dean Fredrickson for the invitation here, and also to lots of the friendly faces in the audience that I see and recognize. And thanks to Elspeth for her help in orchestrating the visit, too. So there you are. So thanks so much. I'm here to talk a little bit about the role of digital media and the role that I think that it can play in young children's learning. And so my focus is on children in the preschool years, which is an important distinction in this work because there are so many differences when we're talking about technology for infants and toddlers from preschool. And I'm going to talk about some interventions primarily that target children living in poverty and the teachers that serve them. Interventions that employ digital media in some way, mainly as a means to augment or enhance young children's readiness to succeed in school. In my presentation, as I always do in my work, I try to take and highlight a systemic perspective on educational improvement, equity, and diversity. Head Start, as well as the Ready to Learn program that I'll discuss a little bit in this talk, are both efforts that aim fundamentally to combat poverty systematically and systemically through efforts that target young children who are living and growing up in poverty. And although I'm going to talk about specific innovations here tonight that use technology, I want to emphasize the way that they act as potential leverage points for systemic change, as well as the ways that innovations' impacts are bounded by the systems in which they're implemented. Another perspective I want to bring is the idea of a kind of a cross-setting intervention. A number of the interventions I'm going to talk about draw on assets from public media or public television that appear in children's homes. And therefore, they have the potential to impact children across settings, to link, for example, home and school. One of the key features of media ecologies today, too, for young children is that they're diverse. Not just as broadcast, but they have the potential to reach across settings. Content on the internet is potentially shareable across many different settings, as well as apps that travel with people wherever they go on their smartphones and other mobile devices. We live in an environment that even for very young children, I think we recognize is saturated with media wherever they go. And on the one hand, I think this makes media, the potential for media as a leverage point for intervention and change across the settings of children's lives great. But also, I want to underscore here and begin by recognizing that it's a cause of great concern for many. This cover photo from April's forthcoming Atlantic Monthly expressed one question that many people ask, namely, how is new technology affecting young children's development? The overtones, I think, in this question on the cover speak to worry and concern, and the picture embodies one of those concerns that many have expressed about technology's impact on early development. We see a girl whose face is buried in a screen, isolated from social partners or any other features of a setting we'd imagine facilitating young children's development. It's like a blue screen behind her. The picture's almost inviting us to ask, as others have, whether technology is taking away from time spent with others and enrich interactions with materials other than screens. Some of the fears expressed about technology pertain to the ways that they interfere with how we as adults interact with young children. In an opinion piece just last month, the psychologist Barbara Fredrickson raised the prospect that our love of being connected to devices may have a toll on our biological capacity to connect with other people. Many of us may worry that our young children see too little of us, not because we're not in the room with them, but because we're not present to them. It's as if, the opinion piece laments, we're choosing between our phones and our hearts. None other than the American Academy of Pediatrics has warned against the dangers of media as well, especially for very young children. In a policy statement issued, or rather reissued, in 2011, the Academy reinforced its position that children under 2 should have minimal screen time. Instead of screens, they recommend that parents opt for supervised independent play for infants and young children during times that a parent can't sit down and actively engage or play with a child. But what about this? Are the videos that target very young children under 2, as any of you or parents have probably received, are they the same as this? Educational television targeting 3 or 4-year-olds and teaching them basic literacy skills? What difference might the content and age make, such that one might be beneficial and the other not? Or are both harmful to young children? And what do we make of a very different set of guidance from that of the Pediatrics group that comes from the National Association for the Education of Young Children, a leading professional organization that provides guidance to the field on best practices in early childhood education, and the Fred Rogers Center for Early Learning on children's media, which focuses, this organization focuses on providing guidance as well to the field on digital media. And in their statement, they really argue that interactive media can be used in ways to support the development of young children. Their statement really reflects a very different view of media and its potential benefits from those who are worried mainly about its harmful effects. Fred Rogers, for whom that center is named and is really intended to be part of his legacy, got into television because he saw that television was a powerful medium, and he didn't like what he saw. Children's television programming was full of demeaning behavior, he thought, and he wanted to convey a different message, one he shared in testimony that's fairly famous that many of you have probably seen before the U.S. Senate more than 40 years ago. And it's a vision of child development that he puts forth that I think those of us who share in the responsibility of educating young children share. He put social and young people's development first, but he saw that there was this powerful medium. And so this statement reflects a very different view of that. In that statement, the joint position statement puts teachers in the lead. So it says there's a role, but there's a really significant role for teachers. For one, it says that teachers should be put in charge of selecting what technology to use, and that their primary consideration should be the health and well-being of the young people. So will this actually benefit their development? Developmentally appropriate programming, a hallmark of the NAEYC, should guide the decision-making. What's developmentally appropriate? It's teachers who have to decide how to use and also how to integrate technology. So it's not enough just to have this as an add-on, but it needs to fit into the environment, curriculum, into the daily routines of preschool. It needs to enhance practice. So how does it actually support teachers in enhancing their own practice in assessment and also in helping bridge home and school? Teachers also have to do the work of evaluating whether technology is working or not in their classrooms. Now, interestingly, in contrast in some ways to some of the innovations I'm going to focus on, a lot of the NAEYC and Fred Rogers' statement focuses on evaluating technologies that prepare kids to use technology. Now, what I'm going to focus and talk about today is more technologies that support learning for school readiness in the areas primarily of literacy today I'm going to talk about, but also in mathematics, science, and other areas. So I want to frame my remarks tonight by honoring the fact that there are different viewpoints about the appropriateness of promoting the use of digital media in early childhood education. And I actually deeply respect the decision by many educators to focus their attention elsewhere in terms of improving teaching and learning. But I want to explore also for tonight what it would mean if we did accept the premise that technology could be used effectively in early childhood. So the questions or dilemmas that frame this discussion for tonight are, what criteria can teachers use to select the digital media that they might integrate? What evidence here is that their digital media can support learning? And then I'll turn in the second part of the presentation to really think about questions of implementation. So how can teachers use developmental digital media in intentional and developmentally appropriate ways to integrate it into their curriculum? But also, if we discover that there are some effective interventions, how do we make them accessible to all children and support their implementation? So what do we know about technology and learning? Because I think that's clearly a first question to be asking. And I want to talk to you about how I parse the research in the field, because I think each piece of this is has something to contribute, both directly to teachers, but also our knowledge of interventions. There are two sets on the left of what I call, borrowing a phrase from Barbara Rogoff's theory of human development, intent participation studies. So those of you who know Barbara's work, she studies how learning and development are a process of transformation of participation in valued social activities. And one of the things that she highlights in contrast to, say, instructivist or instructional learning is that in all societies, we learn through observation. And she actually cites some of the work on children's learning from educational television as an example of learning through intent participation. And what intent participation means is learning actively through actively observing and listening in ongoing activities as they participate in shared endeavors. Now, we often think about media use, even individual use, as just a kid and a screen. But what this highlights is that it's actually a kid and a screen in a social setting, often with other people there. So what I want to focus on is some of the research here on intent participation in which children are interacting with media with others present in particular kinds of settings. There are two kinds of that research that I think are very valuable. One is the study in the wild, so to speak, of children's media use in everyday settings. These are largely ethnographic studies. Intent participation in laboratory settings actually try to manipulate different kinds of ways that kids might engage with others and media at the same time to better understand how to augment learning. There are also, and this is what people are familiar with, say, through the Pew Internet studies, are these large-scale studies that are either observational or survey in nature that tell us about trends in technology use. And then finally, and I'll talk about some of these here today, there are intervention studies of media and learning that are experimental studies or quasi-experimental studies that test the impacts of specific interventions. So we can learn different things from these different kinds of studies. One of the ways I think that we need to take advantage of the studies in the wild or in everyday routines is how do we leverage what people actually do in the world and turn them into designs? And so part of that depends on how diverse our settings are. We need to be in very diverse kinds of settings with different kinds of kids to understand the ways that they engage with others and using media. And I'll give an example of all of these in a minute. In experimental settings, I think this is one of the key places where we can help give teachers guidance about selecting media that they encounter in the world. So they find an app in the world and say, well, how do I actually judge this? What are its potentials in terms of learning, given what we know about how kids learn from interacting with media? And then what can I do to augment that learning or make sure that we're benefiting as much from the media as possible? The large-scale observational studies, I'm going to give an example of how I think this needs to help us to think hard about the diversities of contexts in which children have access to and make use of technology. And so those should guide the ways that we adapt interventions to different settings. But also the large-scale survey work in terms of how kids use technology across different settings can give us a sense of the contribution of different media use in different settings to children's learning. And there have been some studies, I won't talk about them today, but about children in preschool and how they benefit from learning with technology at home across the setting of school. That give us some insight into why it might be beneficial to have access across different sites. And then finally, we're used to thinking about intervention studies as telling us what works, but I'm going to also talk a little bit about a research synthesis we did for the center that help us to think about the criteria or the design features of the interventions that might be linked to more consistently positive outcomes. So let me give you some examples of each of these. My colleague Chris Gutierrez and her postdoc Lisa Schwartz at CU Boulder, as part of their research on a connected learning research network, of which I'm also a part, are studying digital media use in the homes of low-income immigrant children in Colorado. They're documenting practices for gameplay, television viewing, and internet usage in children's homes. The children in these families share, as we see kids doing here, devices, game consoles, screens, and smartphones. They are all in tighter circumstances than many of us in this room. And though technology is ubiquitous, there is not one device per person in these homes. As part of their research then, they're documenting the ways that they manage the sharing of turns and devices in games and among family members, and how this sharing takes place among the negotiations of home life, such as how turns get negotiated between a brother and sister as the sister goes and gets called in to help with cooking dinner. A key concept that they're using to drive their investigations is that of inventos, drawn from the Spanish and Jacob Fantauzzi's documentary use of his term for a film on Cuban hip-hop. The idea of being resourceful and creative, inventing in tight circumstances. Rather than focusing on lack of access here, they're looking at how young children innovate to gain access and play the game in tight circumstances, as well as in response to their position being constructed through age and gender. They're hoping to leverage these practices as they analyze them in an after-school program called El Pueblo Mágico, which includes many opportunities for children to practice collaboration and engage with technology for design and making. They want to work with children in a kind of miscue analysis to analyze with them how they orchestrate their participation, attention, and instruction of their peers in joint media activity. And they want to discuss with them, what are some rules for participation that young people can recognize and value? What might you want to change about those rules? Because as you might imagine, in family life, those rules aren't always fair. There's a lot of fighting that gets intermingled with this. So they want to actually try to leverage that into something more productive, but also that connects the home and school. I want to share some findings from two different experimental participation studies. Recall that one of the roles that I think that these help us play is to understand what kind of guidance to give to teachers. A classic study by Reiser and colleagues is one that is associated with the concept of co-viewing, or intentional mediation of viewing of children. So in their study, they brought people into a laboratory setting, and children were randomly assigned to either watch Sesame Street, several episodes of Sesame Street solo, or in one of three different joint engagement conditions. in which kids were either just, parents were either asked to say, attend to this, and the one that was most effective, though, was one in which parents actually co-engaged with them in having them actually speak. Some of it was about letters, so like practice saying the letters yourself. And they also gave children feedback on whether they were correct or not. And compared to the solo and the other conditions, this was much more effective as a means of supporting children's comprehension of the letters that they were learning in the story. And so this is just one of several studies that point to the concrete actions that parents can take while engaging their children in educational television viewing. A very different kind of intervention is what are sometimes called talking books or e-books, where children can actually have a book that's partly read to them. But they actually get to control the interaction. And so it'll speak different parts of them, help them with words and identifying words. Sandy Calvert and colleagues did some work in 2005 with one of these kinds of books that was connected to the program Blue's Clues, which was on television, but this was an e-book that lived online. And in that condition, they looked at whether, what difference it made when the child had the mouse, the adult had the mouse, or that was shared. And one of the things that was really interesting was the importance in terms of interest and engagement, which is often thought of as a precondition for learning, were much higher and sustained when the child was in control of the mouse. But at the same time, there weren't any difference in the learning. So one of the things that, and this comes up in some of our reviews, that we're I would say is an open question, is what's the right balance of choice, which supports interest, but also, what will make a difference in terms of learning? How do we actually guide children through a sequence in their interactions with media, especially kind of the world of apps and games? How does sequence matter? So observational studies. And Gail was mentioning one to me today about finding something that she's doing right now, which is just to know what percentage of preschool classrooms actually have technology. And her findings here in this state are similar to ones that Ellen Martella and colleagues found a couple of years ago, which is it's under about 50% have any kind of computer technology. So when we talk about this context of designing for preschool and Head Start, there is not much technology, and much of what is there is old. Access to the internet is often limited in classrooms. It might exist in the office of the preschool setting, but not necessarily in the classrooms themselves. And then the knowledge of what are capabilities of computers among the teachers is very limited. So that's one of the important contexts when we think about design here that we think about. But I want to also highlight this because it underscores some of the findings that my colleague Chris Gutierrez and Lisa Schwartz have come up with and what they're seeing ethnographically, which is, this is from a Pew report. And I've highlighted a key thing I want you to note, which is this is the demographics of smartphone users who primarily go online on their smartphones. And so you can see this is just last year, or a couple years ago now, but 40% of low-income families, this is their primary source of the internet. So when we think about families living in poverty and designing for access, this is a really important thing to consider, is what's that screen real estate? What kind of interactivity? And how are they negotiating the turn-taking and sharing of that device? So one way that I want to highlight here of using the observational studies is to really appreciate the diversity of contexts. So it's as much not just the overall trends, but the differentiation and what it means to design for all access for all might need to take into account these sorts of things. So while the image on the bottom is the image familiar to us, I mean, in my household, there's more than one device per person. But in low-income families, that smartphone is shared by everybody to get on the internet in many families. So what about interventions? And I'll talk a little bit and pause and show a little video of our Ready to Learn intervention in a minute. But I want to just give you a sense of the landscape. For many years, the mainstay of educational technology were computer-aided instructional programs that basically provide drill and practice. And they've targeted elementary schools, but there are interventions that target preschools and that actually have some evidence of impact on phonological awareness. So that exists as sort of a small bit of the work. There's also a literature that's primarily Dutch. It took place in the Netherlands and also in Israel, focused on electronic or talking books. Those are ubiquitous here, but the research, interestingly, has taken place in Europe and in Israel. And then the largest body of work, I would say, is on television viewing. And I want to underscore, you'll hear me talk a lot about television. Television is still, television and games are the primary means of consumption still today in early childhood and in homes. So we need to remember that there is this body of literature that's actually 40 years long of robust research on educational television. And it's mostly positive. And very striking in that respect. Among educational interventions, this is one of the best researched areas and one where there's a really good track record of intervention. The new things, and I'm going to give an example of, is what borrowing a term from Henry Jenkins, will call transmedia interventions. That is, interventions that couple interactions with, say, television media, with interactive games, and print materials that all focus on similar characters or an identity of a program, or in public media land, what we call an asset, and try to actually reinforce skills and practice across different media around a similar theme. Because that's kind of new, and I've done some research in that area, I'll go a little bit in detail about this one. I don't want to go into depth into the findings here, but I'll just briefly mention this is work that my colleagues at EDC and SRI, we did from 2007 to 2010-11 around a curriculum supplement that's a 10-week supplement that we actually designed and pulled together elements from 3 programs, Sesame Street, Between the Lions, and Super Y. It was a sequence that focused on basic early literacy or early literacy skills, and it integrated different elements of these programs in terms of video watching, but also the games that are on the PBS Kids website, book reading, and activities that went with the themes there. And I'm going to show you a video in a minute of like what people were sort of thinking about this in the sites in the New York part of the site. We did a random assignment study, cluster randomized design with 80 preschool classrooms in the New York area and San Francisco Bay Area. About 400 students were in this study. We found positive impacts in 3 areas that are really key for early literacy: letter knowledge, letter sounds, and concepts of print. And the results were not uniform, so the people who benefited most were the lowest quintile on the pretest. So this was a potentially gap-closing kind of intervention in terms of getting kids ready for school. The results of this, if people are interested, appeared in Early Childhood Research Quarterly last year in 2012. I'm going to hope that the transition to video will work here in a second.
Find a seat, please. You're going to sit right there.
One of our goals in Head Start is to support children's emergent literacy. And in reading the description of the project, we were interested to see how the study would complement what we're doing in the classroom.
I see the princess.
You see the princess?
And the letter E in this word sounds like eh. Write an E with me.
Let's make an E. You're going to make me go down, across, and across.
The students across the board in both of our classrooms were very engaged.
Hooray!
They enjoyed watching the characters and helping them solve the problem.
W, X, Y.
And what's come next? What's Z. Let's see if it's Z.
Z.
It is Z. Very good.
We made it to the top of the beanstalk.
Seeing the teachers invested in it and excited about it, that to me was very valuable because they were also enjoying what they were doing with the children.
What letter did I make? Look at that. Oh. I learned so much, and seeing how the children grasp the concepts that we were trying to make, it was just fantastic. I loved it, and they loved it. Can you sing the ABC song with me?
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P,
See it?
Q, R, S, T.
We saw clearly that the teachers were invested in the curriculum, in the study. They saw development in the children.
What is that? What do you say?
Vinyl.
What color do you think it is?
Red.
That's red, begin with R.
They also saw development in themselves. So it was a win-win situation. So I would definitely recommend this curriculum for children.
Arms in. Put your arm in.
Put your arms in.
Super Readers.
To the rescue.
So I show that in part because it's also going to help me make some points in a few minutes about different elements there. But you see in this video, too, some examples of intentional mediation and joint engagement that's actually written into the curriculum guidance in that particular curriculum. So part of those materials were about helping that teacher and the teachers in the curriculum pause the video at different points. So they're not watching television, they're actually watching a DVD, and there's a big pause button that appears in the middle at different stages. And then there's activities that they do to actually get the kids to engage. And I will say, too, that many of the teachers, I don't think they were skeptical, they were willing to give this a try with technology. But many of them, I think, found that the integration in this curriculum really gave them a little bit new insight on literacy teaching in general. And that was what they told us at the end. A comparison group actually got a science curriculum that used materials from PEEP and the Big Wide World, which is a WGBH production, and Sid the Science Kit, which is still on PBS Kids. And for them, many of them did no science instruction before that, and it really provided a springboard for them to be able to see the ways that they could actually do science in preschool. So in both conditions, we found sort of an openness and a sort of sense in which the curriculum helped really support them making some changes to their practice. And we did a follow-up study, something in the order of about 75% of the teachers continued to use the materials after the study was over. So I think they made some adaptations to that maybe it could have diminished its impact, but we do know that they continue to use it afterwards. So this is just one intervention, and I want to mention some work that was supported through NCQTL, the center, a synthesis of work that we did looking at research on technology. I'm going to focus on the literacy interventions that we found because it's actually where the most robust literature base is. There's a smaller base, I would say, in mathematics, a little bit in social development, a small literature actually on technology for autism. But the literature base lags, as it does in most educational technology, lags behind innovation pretty severely. But we did find 13 different interventions with evidence from experimental and quasi-experimental studies that we included in the synthesis. As many syntheses do today, for any of you who've done deep synthesis work, you'll find it frustrating that they're missing data that would allow you to compare effect sizes. You have to figure out problems of how to count studies. So one of the things that I've done is applied a method for qualitative analysis called fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis, developed by Charles Reagan and colleagues. To actually treat, what I've done is in the synthesis, what we did is treat the interventions as cases. So that these are interventions that have particular qualities. And the nice thing about QCA as a technique, it works on set theory, so it allows us to look at the different configurations of designs that are associated with more consistent outcomes. And so when I say more consistent outcomes, I actually used the IES, U.S. Department of Education standards for what would count as consistent evidence for that. And then I looked at the features. So what were some of the features we looked at for interventions? So one is this idea of transmedia. Does that matter that this concept came about, and why people actually tried transmedia interventions is Susan Newman wrote about this concept of media synergy, that instead of distracting, technology could actually be used to augment across different channels. For those of you who know the psychological theory of dual coding, there's the idea that actually we can learn better when things are encoded on multiple channels. So the idea of media synergy is to try to actually harness that for design. And so I actually give an example of this from our science intervention. Up top, you see, well, on the bottom is a Sid the Science Kid episode where they actually create ice pops. And so they're putting this in the freezer, and Sid's watching it freeze. And the children actually do this in the intervention themselves. And they watch the video, they hear the discussion. So this is an example of trying to create synergy. Another medium, and this is borne out in research by Deb Linebarger and colleagues, is the importance of identification with characters. And I thought this little snippet from one of the videos that EDC created of a child with the Sid microphone, and you can see Sid carries a microphone, and sort of he's like a reporter. And so they have this as kind of like a talking stick where they pass around for children to talk and get a turn. But it's also about promoting that identification across the different media. Now, you know, Henry Jenkins and others got this idea from advertising, but the idea here is to how do we leverage that in education for intentional purposes to try to build identification. So that's sort of the one of the theoretical bases for these. So the other thing we looked at is to what extent are the interactions contingent but also sequenced. So by contingent, I mean like actually interactive. Television is not literally interactive. It's sort of on a scale of interactivity. The original Sesame Street didn't really interact with the audience or invite interaction, direct interaction with the audience. Along came Blue's Clues, as Malcolm Gladwell sort of really recounted in The Tipping Point. For those of you who read, it's a great chapter on the revolution in educational television. All of a sudden, they created this revolution both by having repetition, but also encouraging direct interaction. So this is sort of like a little bit of interactivity. But then, as we know, like the apps and games and things that are available to young children they have a much more heightened interactivity. They're very contingent on what the child interacts with. The PBS Kids Island is a good example of sequenced interaction, as was our transmedia curriculum. So we have that, but it's maybe like only parts of it are high on the interactivity scale. So the PBS Kids Island takes you through kind of a maze and allows teachers also to track progress towards specific things. But you have to go through certain skills before they get unlocked. And part of why we put this in there as a criterion to look at for designs is that there's some research that says that the total free rein choice with respect to apps and games is not as effective as actually having some sort of sequence. But again, as I was mentioning earlier, there's kind of a sweet spot that is very difficult to know between choice on the one hand and having that sequence. And I think that's just an empirical question for nearly every intervention to really wrestle with, is what's that right mix? Because the choice supports the interest and engagement, but the sequence also ensures that there's not just gaming the game, which you see a lot of in educational games in the elementary level. The other thing, and we saw this example, is intentional mediation by the adult. So we wanted to look at that in terms of our review. To what extent did intervention designs have that? So in QCA, what you look at are two things that are fairly actually simple and easy to explain. How consistent is a particular configuration? Well, let me say this. For one is that QCA allows for multiple pathways to accomplish a result, which is another reason I like it. So one of the reasons that what we want to look at is what combination of features would actually account for the positive outcomes. And that would mean those that are consistent with the outcomes. But also you want coverage. Like, so if of my 13 interventions in there, how much do these pathways account for the different, the set of outcomes that I have? So we look at consistency and coverage. So if you were just to look at contingent and sequenced interaction, you'd be 85%, meaning that that's really a key feature of programs, is to have that combination of contingent and sequence. But we get better coverage, maybe less consistency, when we add the intentional mediation. So I like to think of these as a couple of pathways through which you'd have teachers to be looking for in terms of, well, is there contingency here? Do I get interactivity? Is it sequenced? But also, does it support this joint media engagement or intentional mediation? So one of the challenges is as with all interventions, what happens when the research ends? What happens when our scale-up project stops? And so the question that we want to ask is, like, how can teachers use digital media in intentional ways and integrate them into their curriculum, partly on their own? How do they actually go out and select those and evaluate those and so forth? But then also ask ourselves the question, if technology-supported interventions can benefit learning, how do we make them accessible to all children and support their implementation? And these are systems questions. We don't get there by scaling up. As I often say, scaling up is a lousy theory of action for systems change because there's so little in the way of our educational systems in terms of infrastructure for improvement. And so we have to actually think about that, and I'll say some more about that in a minute. So what I want to talk about a little bit are some things that we're doing at CU with support from folks here at UW and also my colleagues at SRI that are supports for early childhood educators in terms of their own practice. I'll talk a little bit about the technology and learning module that we're developing for the higher ed initiative and the coaching companion. But I want to frame this in terms of a research model that my colleague Barry Fishman and I and others at SRI and folks here like Phil Bell are working on design-based implementation research, and say a few things about that. So the perspective that I emphasize about the need to change infrastructures really undergirds these principles that I think characterize a real turn towards designing for change in systems. So the first principle of that is that we have to think about forming teams that focus on persistent problems of practice from multiple stakeholders' perspectives. When we design interventions in the academy, we're often not thinking about the problems of practice as practitioners conceive them. So to be disciplined by those problems, but also to recognize that it's a very intensive process of negotiation to actually figure out the different stakeholders, which shouldn't just include teachers, but need to include children and youth, and need to include members of the community who may be ill-served by school systems. But to think about those diverse stakeholders and what do they see as the problems of practice to tackle, and that teams form around those. What do those teams do? One is they're trying to improve practice. So they're not just designing an innovation, but they're trying to transform and change practice. And they commit to a collaborative process of design that's iterative. So engaging people collaboratively in design is really key to changing systems. You can't postpone questions of implementation, as some research policy suggests, until after you've proven the efficacy of evaluation in an evaluation study. You will be doomed to have that thing fail when it's thrown out into the big wide world, I would claim. And I think for me, that's one of the things that accounts for all the $15 to $20 million studies with no effects. That of very powerful, potentially powerful interventions, because we haven't thought about the systems they're going into. A third principle of DBIR is a strategy for promoting quality in the research and development process. They develop theory both related to learning and implementation through inquiry. So one of the things we tend to do in the learning sciences is we focus on the classroom learning in the kid. But we don't actually leverage theory about, for example, how organizational routines can support innovation. How does teacher learning happen? How do institutions change, and how do ideas filter through social networks and institutions? So we work with an impoverished theory set for actually engaging these problems if we only focus on children's learning. We need to focus, paradoxically, on both children's learning and these organizational and the adult learning components if we really want to make a difference in systems. And the examples I think I'm going to present speak to that adult learning component. The other thing is developing capacity for sustaining change in systems. So if we think about that from the practice side, it's how do systems actually develop improvement infrastructures, ways that actually support continuous improvement. But when Barry and I talk about this work, we don't just mean capacity of the practice side of things. We actually mean the capacity of the partnership. In DBIR, the researchers don't go away at the end. They stick around and figure out the next problem to work on. And so the question is, it's the capacity of that team to continuously improve, to tackle the next problem that they're going to work on together. So this is about long-term local partnerships for the most part, mostly local. It can be broader in network, but these are things that are lasting. And we think about, the kinds of skills that we need doctoral students to come out with to be able to do this work are very different from the kinds that would just be doing straight research. So that's part of the capacity of the research system to do this work. So what are some examples of DBIR, or at least designs that focus on this other level I want to talk about that we're doing through NCQTL? So, we're preparing teachers to integrate digital media into curriculum through our module for the Higher Education Initiative. And then we've got some technology supports I'll talk to you briefly about in the coaching companion that really support more general instructional improvement practices. So with our technology module, we have a few objectives, and I want to focus really on, I'll just mention the first two in particular, which are, we want to help teachers with this, people who are prospective preschool teachers who are getting, we're targeting folks who are on a BA program to become comfortable with evaluating what are some features that I see in these digital media, what should I look for? And then we also wanted to help them to develop particular strategies for intentional joint media engagement so that they can enhance children's learning with these apps. And they're also involved, I'll just mention, as part of the module, there's kind of a service learning and enactment part of this in which young people actually take our SID the Science Kid curriculum supplement, and the students actually enact it in a preschool setting and do some reflection around it. But the piece I want to highlight is that first one, because it leverages the ideas that we generated in the literature review about what kinds of features. It also leverages an existing infrastructure. So part of what I think we want to do in DBIR is not so much build the new thing, but how do we leverage existing infrastructures effectively? So through a kind of informal partnership with Common Sense Media, they've got a new site that they've beefed up through the leadership of one of their education leaders, Sita Pai. Common Sense Media is a nonprofit in San Francisco that primarily targets a parent audience, and it has for many years conducted reviews of movies, films, games, and technology apps. It has been driven historically by a fairly negative view of the role of media. But they're shifting towards, intentionally trying to shift towards a learning focus. And one of the things they've introduced is these learning reviews. So one of the things that we did in the course that I ran last fall in a technology and learning class at CU is, as part of the preschool module, I had students play an app that targeted young students and get really familiar with it, play a game or an app and choose that, and write a review that was both in the format of this, but also that attended to the features that they were learning about in their reading so that they get some application. And what it really did was allow the students to apply some evidence-based criteria to evaluate the potential of learning for technology for integration. And also, as part of the review, I had them think about how they could augment through their own mediation and through what they were learning in class, through their own actions, the learning of the students. The students actually really liked this. I assigned one of them, and they said, well, we want more of those. So the next time we run the course, we're actually going to do a lot of them. And it just speaks to this reality out there, is that because the research is going to perpetually lag behind in technology. So there really is going to be a burden on teachers to actually make the judgment call about what works. So we really do need that research base that's from all four of those quadrants to understand that, but especially actually these sort of lab studies that help us understand and really tease apart what are some features that we should be looking for. So I'll mention, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the coaching companion briefly too. So its purpose is to help develop a digital or online tool to support Head Start staff, teachers and coaches as they engage in the coaching process. It's actually for both coach-teacher, like expert coaching, but also peer coaching and self-coaching. The tool is intended to be usable by a wide variety of Head Start coaches and teachers in different kinds of settings. a support and also not a hindrance to the work of coaching. And for enacting best practices from the framework that has been developed by the center called the House Framework, and something called the practice-based coaching model, which the coaching team has developed as part of the center work. That coaching model is sort of is a cycle that begins with a needs assessment, follows through shared goals and action planning, includes and specifies the need for focused observation, which often includes video, developing video and taking video records of practice, and the tool supports that, and also providing feedback and reflection. One of the key things here is this. You'll see this is an actual piece from a screenshot showing the action plans. So action planning is sort of an essential part of coaching, but a lot of that happens in some centers. It happens with technology, but as you might imagine, it happens on paper. So this is a means for actually supporting the development, revision, and tracking progress towards action planning in this particular way. Who is the team and stakeholders? Well, I want to call out Joan Davis and Alex Walker and Sean Fullerton here at UW, who have been the leads on the development side and really have made this thing happen. There are researchers and developers on here. You know, it embodies the idea of user-centered and participatory design, in that one of our key stakeholders here is actually the coaching team of the center. So we're in constant connection with, we have a member of that team actually on our design team. And then we've involved sites, Head Start sites, coaches and teachers throughout all the phases of the design process, in both providing us with feedback, input into the user interface, and so forth as we've developed. And so we have multiple stakeholders that we try to triangulate, and I'll say a little bit about what some of those design challenges are. The design process is consistent with DBIR process, a kind of a iterative, collaborative process. We began actually user testing with a set of commercial tools last year that were out there, and we did this purposefully to help really engage the practitioners in design. We put contrasting video support tools, reflection tools, and contrasting project management tools in front of Head Start coaches and teachers, and had them tell us what they liked better about each of these features. Now, part of the challenge and the opportunity of engaging practitioners in design is that none of us are great when we just say, well, I'd like this feature, I'd like that feature. So part of it is providing that contrasting cases and really getting them into the design process. So it definitely slowed us down, but then we came in with a really good set of requirements that we could come up with, and a web app that we've been iterating over this year. We're doing a little bit of user testing with a small user base right now, and we'll be beginning some implementation research later this spring and into the summer to really actually study use both observationally, and I think Gail Joseph's class actually gave this a whirl as part of the Head Start, as part of her class, and we're envisioning this can be part of the higher ed initiative too, as a resource and tool for them. It is disciplined by a set of problems of practice, and so I want to emphasize, kind of what are those problems, and also what are the practice constraints that we've been designing for. So we want to provide a means of documenting the process of action planning as a focal challenge, but also supporting video reflection. So the tool allows you to actually upload short clips of video, comment and reflect on those, and to share those with a team that you actually control. But there's some important constraints. So one of the things that's challenging is this is a web app right now, but I've already mentioned to you there's no internet access in many Head Start classrooms. So the intervention itself of this coaching tool has to be able to work across different settings. The other piece is a real intrinsic institutional dilemma, which is that the ideal is to have shared control over access to the content by the teacher and coach to really preserve that as a learning relationship as opposed to a supervisory relationship. The key design tensions in that, though, are, as you might imagine, that we've actually highlighted in our work. And part of this is our implementation research, is to try to document that one of the things that we do early in DBIR is actually try to be systematic about capturing what are the design dilemmas that you're wrestling with, and also feeding those back to the stakeholders to say, are we getting this right? So this is something we've actually fed back to our different stakeholders and say, do we understand these as the tensions that we're wrestling with? So one is this issue of how to be portable, but also accessible when we're in these sites that are not online. Another issue is alignment to the practice-based coaching model so that it actually supports something that the center is trying to do, but also the recognition that in many sites they have well-developed coaching models that sort of map on to the practice coaching model, but they actually already have procedures and routines in place. And that's the case for the site that we've been piloting in Colorado. So we're sort of wrestling with how do we actually balance the need for flexibility, but also to really tightly scaffold to the model. The other thing is the tension that I think it has to do with the fact that many coaches are also supervisors. And that there's a need for individual learning, but also supervisors and center directors, they want to be able to use this tool for program improvement. So you make available data, and I've seen this in the K-12 setting in a lot of my work in formative assessment. And the first thing you see when you see technology that has assessment data is, how do I get this for my program? And you can't just ignore that and say, well, this is just for the teachers, because a key stakeholder and gatekeeper for being able to use the companion will be these center directors. So we've been wrestling with, like, how do we preserve the privacy and put that in control of the coach-teacher relationship while providing some sets of views for administrators. As we go into the field, we'll be asking certain questions about how the technology mediates the coach-teacher interaction. In our initial design charrette, people really worried about, is this going to get in the way of relationships? So we actually are going to be looking at that. How frequently they use different functions of the tool and why. What are some of the challenges and learning needs that remain after initial use? And what are some of the perceived benefits in relationship to the efficacy of coaching? So we're starting with implementation, and I can imagine over the long haul, once you get to scale, we'll be ready to actually look at sort of what are the actual impacts of the tool or integrating this tool into practice. I want to close my part before opening question with talking a little bit about some emerging uses and tell you about some really work that's exciting to me. I was involved in the proposal effort before I left SRI, but I haven't been able to continue with this work, but I think it's really quite exciting. We're seeing a sharper focus on STEM learning in early childhood, and also thinking about how do we leverage the interfaces that allow for collaborative control, not just joint engagement. Tablets. It's one thing to say, let's promote collaboration and technology use when every single game that's designed for kids is an individual player game, for young kids. And that's really the app world right now as we know it, is largely individual games. And I've seen this in Chris Gutierrez's site in El Pueblo Mágico. They really struggle with, that whole site is about engendering teamwork and collaboration, and yet all the technologies really don't afford that. So really the neat thing about multi-touch and tablets is the potential to actually start to design for multiple player games at the same time. And so some of my colleagues are doing that at EDC and SRI in collaboration with WGBH. So they're involved in a project called the Next Generation Preschool Math Project. I apologize for how small everything is, but I'll just go through kind of what they're developing. It's a transmedia intervention. And it's a collaboration among researchers and media developers and preschool staff to develop a 2-unit preschool math curriculum supplement that supports their learning of 2 key skills in early math: subitizing, sort of the ability to count sort of automatically, and sort of equipartitioning or fair sharing. So how do kids learn how to fair share? So early developmental research suggests there's actually 2 very important but related but independent skills: counting on the one hand, and this fair sharing or splitting, equal splitting. And why equal splitting is so important is that it becomes a foundation for fractions understanding, multiplication, and division, among other things. So rational number reasoning becomes, which is a huge problem, right, in elementary school. So there's not very much work on that. My colleague Jared Comfrey at NC State has done a lot of that work. We're relying very heavily on Doug Clement's work on the counting. They're working on that work. And this is a collaboration. It's funded through the National Science Foundation's DR K-12 program, collaboration among EDC, SRI, and WGBH. So one of the things they're doing, I wanted to show you one of the joint games and show you a little bit, or just show you a video. You can see that the transmedia intervention includes games, a set of books, One of the books around equipartitioning is The Doorbell Rang, which is a wonderful children's book about having to split up cookies as new guests come and try to do so fairly, ring the doorbell. Finger plays, rhymes, and songs, hands-on activities, snack time and daily routine. So remember that guidance that said it's got to integrate with the routine. So they actually try to think, they've developed some activities that work within the routines of preschool. So that's, again, one of the reasons, theoretically you think about how do we integrate into organizational routines? How do interventions become part of them? And I'll show you this game called Photo Friends, and you'll see Jillian, one of the GBH producer, Jillian Orr, one of the GBH producers, talking about it.
My name is Jillian Orr, and I'm an associate producer on the Next Generation Preschool Math Project. Photo Friends is an equipartitioning game that's made for 2 players, and in Photo Friends, children learn to share equally. They learn to equipartition and to give the same number of items to each of the people in the game. It's a collaborative game.
So you're gonna play with nice studies, Elias. Turn it
Right
on. Good. Say cheese.
One player takes a picture of the other player, and then they switch. And so then both of them are in the scenes in the game. And they have an equipartitioning task where they'll see their faces in rocket ships or on any number of things, and they get to equipartition the missing pieces for whatever their characters' faces are on. So maybe they're squirrels, and you have to distribute the acorns so that every squirrel gets the same number of acorns, and the children get to see their faces in the little squirrel outfits. Or maybe they're robots, and they have to equipartition the arms or share the arms fairly between the robots so that every robot gets 2 arms and just 2 arms. And Photo Friends is a collaborative game, and so both of the children are in the game, and they get to work together, and they get to see each other, which makes it really fun. They're totally immersed in the game. But it's important, too, when you're pairing the children together to think about their math ability or their comfort level with the technology. Think about how you might pair them together so that both children can learn. Maybe one child becomes the teacher and the other is learning from, or maybe they're both learning together. Explore different ways of collaboration. You know your class best, and you know your children the best.
Did he put on 4 arms and 1 robot? No, hey, that's mine. That's mine. And how many in the other one?
When we play Photo Friends with our children, they love it because they love being a part of the game.
And so one of the things that they're finding in terms of looking at some of the video just already is that these things don't sort of map out very easily. Like when you have the joint player game, just because one child is controlling doesn't mean they're doing all the work. But also the person who's directing, there's some interesting dynamics that aren't really straightforward when you actually study like who's doing what and who's sort of doing the heavy lifting and the thinking in the game. So that's one of the pieces of research. They're framing what they do as design-based implementation research, and I have this report that I recommend from that Barbara Means at SRI developed and is published by the Office of Educational Technology on expanding evidence approaches in learning in a digital world, where they talk about DBIR a little bit in this world. And this is the next generation preschool math process is talked about in that report. But some key things are this collaborative design. One of the things that they've done, and my colleague Phil Vahey at SRI talks about really nicely, traditionally media producers, when they use the word curriculum very differently than we do in education, it's actually just a list of the things that they're going to cover in a particular TV show. And so one of the things they had to do very early on the collaboration is create a boundary object that would enable them to talk across the worlds of research and media production. But you can imagine the joy that the researchers feel when all of a sudden the stuff that they've been, we in learning sciences, we like to do our own thing, and it doesn't look all that great. When GBH producers put something together, it looks awesome. And they work fast, too, not in our slow pace. So the other piece that I've already mentioned is that it's designed to integrate with existing structures and routines into preschools. And then one of the things they're doing is they're doing a lot of rapid iteration. One of the hallmarks, I think, of DBIR is instead of the researchers leading the implementation, from the get-go you actually have the preschool teachers, they're having the preschool teachers try this out and lead it themselves. And taking the evidence that they're learning about teacher adaptations where they're having difficulty to do that, to design iteratively and design the additional supports for research. So I would just want to actually close with a thank you and a couple of links that I'll make available to folks. The Fred Rogers Center is one of the co-authors of that position statement. They are really a focused center around early childhood and learning. You may be interested in that. One of the videos that I showed you is from EDC, and those are, you will find the studies that I talked about, the study I talked about, as well as several videos which are really well done by my colleagues at EDC around joint media engagement, both in literacy and in science. So, well, thanks, and I'll take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the lecture. It's been very interesting. There was one part in the beginning video that you showed a lady from Head Start program doing a literacy intervention with video.
Right.
When you did your research, did you look at how much intentional teaching in that kind of way had been going on without the use of video?
No, we didn't have that luxury of going in before and studying that. You'd like to do that, right? So, but we didn't have a good classroom observation scheme. Part of what I think we have to incentivize in the research is the ability to go in and do that. We always, in large-scale research, pre- and post-test the students, but it's so rare to be able to have the funding to actually, and this was a funding issue, we would have done this, to be able to study the teacher's practice before and after. And in this study, we had to use teacher logs to actually get at practices. So we do have a sense of the ways that those practices differed from those who were assigned randomly to the science condition. There weren't huge differences that we found. So.
I mean, my main reason for asking that was it seemed that a lot of the support was actually for the teacher, which therefore led to better educational outcomes for the children.
Yes.
And so therefore yes, the media was certainly helping, but had there been intentional teaching before in such an orchestrated way through other means other than video, i.e. with books or letters and so on, would there have been the same outcomes for the children?
Yeah,
that's kind of hard to unpick. I mean, I'm a believer in education.
How does one pick? Well, I think I'm a true design-based researcher, and I believe in putting all the good stuff together and not worrying too much about what's causing what. I don't think it's very valuable to, I think that's for the laboratory, not for the classroom. I think that research is very important, but I'd rather do that in a lab, and in the classroom I want to put my best stuff together and put it all together in one piece. And so when I think about what's the unit of intervention, I borrow a phrase from my colleague Jeremy Rochelle. I think it's the curricular activity system, which includes the combination. What I'm testing is not curriculum, technology. I'm not asking, does technology work? I'm asking, does this system of supports for teachers, for curriculum, for student materials, does that work? And it includes the professional development in that. Another term for that Steve Raudenbush and Raudenbush, Cohen, and Ball all talked about was they call it an instructional regime. So you go and it's very, we're tempted always to ask the question, does technology cause X? You know, and I always think that's a really, it's not, we may want to know whether we should do this, but I would rather say, I don't want to ever use technology as just the intervention anyway. So I want to kind of look at what are the different ways and uses of technology that are more and less productive and how they get integrated. So obviously you would like the resources to really be able to play with different combinations, but the reality is that's rarely feasible to do in a large-scale study.
In the spirit of ideally wanting everyone who's involved in developing those systems to be disciplined by the leading problems of practice in that design-based implementation research way, are the media producers listening? And you're in at least some conversations where there might, not everyone is like the Fred Rogers or the WGBH. And so is there a sense that the media producers are shifting or tracking any of the kind of work that's developing? It's kind of hopeful, maybe.
It's, yeah, it really depends on those. Thanks, Phil, for your question. I do think that one of the reasons I'm really like to follow the educational television is since the mid-'60s, there's been an R&D model that valued the input of like getting information about attention and engagement and learning from the get-go. And so those media producers who are in public media, and this extends to the sort of out-of-the-blue productions that went on to Nickelodeon and some of the other folks, that they value an R&D process that includes a role for research. I don't think that's true in the commercial app world generally. I think there's a commitment to doing things like A/B testing, which would be like randomly assigning virtually without you ever knowing that you're getting this condition versus that condition in terms of trying things out. So there's that level of testing. But I don't think the money is there for a lot of the startup companies, and there are many of them today, to really engage in that collaborative design. So for me, I think there's a role for public funding of public education, educational television, because it affords the continuation of that model.
I was curious about the stakeholders you talked about and how they were involved, teachers, community members, in some of the interventions you talked about today.
Yeah. So I think they range, and part of the DBIR challenge is it's mainly trying to identify and name the ways that people you have included, and maybe also being quite honest about the ones that you haven't. So with the Ready to Learn work, I would say that we didn't do a whole lot of involvement of preschool centers directly in that work because of the time frame that we were under for the U.S. Department of Education. Sort of the other end of the scale, I would say the coaching companion work, where right from the start, we kicked that process off with a design charrette that included both members of the coaching team, but also Head Start coaches and teachers. So we spent, more than half a day with people coming up with requirements, personas, design personas. And so at that place, it's really from the start, doing the commercial testing with us, and now testing an actual app at every level, but also really helping us think about the features. So it isn't just using them as user testers, but helping define the requirements. And I think that's really key, is what are the requirements? What does this thing have to do for me to want to use it and use it in an integral way in my practice? I don't know if that answers your question. So, yeah.
We actually have a question about intentional mediation for older students. Mm-hmm. So use of expert videos, for example, in a classroom where you're wanting students to dig into the practices of that particular expert. Mm-hmm. And if there's sort of a model for using this with high school or middle school age students.
Yeah, it's funny, I immediately went to something that may not fit the example, but I went to youth radio. And something where it's really different because it's a little bit more of a peer pedagogy. So some of you are familiar with youth radio spots on NPR that show. Youth radio runs programs in Berkeley that are out of a radio, and people have an apprenticeship into that. And they write about, Lissa Soep writes about this, and her colleague, can't remember her name, first name, Chavez. They write about a collegial pedagogy that goes on. So what they do in terms of helping kids apprentice is they provide a kind of what might be called a ladder of participation, from really simple participation in you've got to do your own radio show that won't actually broadcast very broadly, to then writing these scripts. And they rely on a lot of peer bootstrapping. So more expert peers actually do a lot of the pedagogy and mediation of the media use. So it's not quite an example of interaction with games and stuff like that, but it's a sort of model of how people can use media for production and making. And I think that for me, that with older youth, and this is mainly from my connected learning research, it's the making and production side of technology that really is what I would tend to emphasize more for those age groups. And there, we're talking about more apprenticeship models. So Digital Youth Network, too, Nicole Pinkert's work would be a good example of that kind of work.
So given the framing that you started out with and the public concern about digital media and probably the cautions that we often get from the medical community then about the screen time and limiting screen time, do you have an opinion on those cautionary advice, that cautionary advice to parents in terms of the work that you do?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a big difference between the 2.5 to 3. Something happens between 2.5 and 3 that is very different in terms of kids' capabilities to learn from video. And so if you look at the research literature, you'll find a big difference between, say, the studies of baby Einstein and those kinds of baby videos, which show either no or deleterious effects on development, and the kind of research on 4- and 5-year-olds where I'm sure there's some publication bias. For educational television, there are benefits. One thing that's true across the whole spectrum is it's not really great to have your kids watch adult programming in the preschool areas at all. That tends to have also a consistently negative effect, violence, but just generally adult programming. One of the theories has to do with that New York Times op-ed piece, which is it draws the attention away for the adult. And if you think about traditional sort of public television, educational television that was on PBS in the 70s and 80s, there was always a layer for the adults. It was kid-directed, but there was a layer of humor and things that you don't see when you went. Part of what Nickelodeon did was actually to say, forget that. We're going to direct programming directly at kids, forget the adult, and sort of let this be the kid world. Now, a lot of Nick Jr. programming has an adult layer, to it, but there was a big difference in that. So, but you're watching with the kid. So I think avoiding adult programming, for that age group is really good, and I think before 2.5, limiting the screen time. Now, I feel like the AAP is very unrealistic if there are second children in the home. I have 2 kids. There was no way I was going to limit screen time of my younger daughter, and she is drawn to the screen too, like and always has been. I just think it's very decontextualized advice that they've given. Most people, especially technologists that work in this area, they limit their kids' screen time. I do. I have a limit, and I think that's appropriate. The setting of limits is something that families have to do, and it sort of sets some guidelines. So.
Just wanted to extend what you just said. Something happens between 2.5 and 3. With regards to the mouse, the use of the mouse versus the use of the finger, is there any recent research that indicates that one is better than the other that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of. So all I know is that a lot of folks at PBS have done that sort of work in a rough and tumble kind of way, and know what sort, like when you go to the PBS Kids website, they've thought about like what age is going to play that game and what kind of mousing skills they would need. But it doesn't exist in the literature. It exists in the heads of people who actually do it in public media. So part of the challenge of all the internal research in public media is there's a lot of knowledge that isn't in there in the field. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
I was wondering, what do you think we can do to move the media development and even the app development into the hands of the teachers themselves, rather than it being made by these external groups? Do you think that's even a positive direction?
You would have to change the structure of the workday first. I mean, I think there's a reason that teachers don't engage in design, is we ask them to do a whole lot of other things. So when we do ask teachers to engage in design, we have to be mindful of that context that they're in. I'm not against reorganizing that workday. I think that would be a really lovely thing to enable teachers to have more time and more authorization and recognition for the ways that they contribute to curriculum projects.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if there was a parent component to being able to bring PBS shows into the classroom for the ECAP or Head Start population.
Yeah.
And was that intentional because the parents also had access to it at home, and were parents made aware so that they could also support their children in that?
Yes, there was a parent component. There was a little sort of a backpack of things that went home to the parent. I would say it was a weaker component in that some of the pressures that we were under were to focus on the classroom setting, but we did have that connection. I didn't talk about it, but one of the things that we found for the science curriculum that I've reported on is that we actually gave parents a survey about what their children talked about at home, and we asked about a lot of the topics in the science kit. And we found a positive impact there where children were talking with their parents more in that science condition about these topics than in the comparison condition. And now my colleagues at SRI, through work in the Life Center, are actually the way they're thinking about this and the way we began thinking about it is how do we bring parent volunteers into the classroom setting to show these mediation skills and involve them in the curriculum that way. So it's actually bringing the parents into that setting where that's feasible for them to do, to also to sort of help strengthen that connection. But obviously that's one of the powers here, is that you can leverage the fact that these technologies are accessible at home and that the conversations can continue. And we, just this fall when we did the SID materials, the preschool teachers told us that the parents were talking about the kids going home and and they called our undergraduates the scientists. Are the scientists coming today? It was a really big experience for them that they were sharing at home. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing this work and for this discussion. I think it's a really important one. I'm a long-time kindergarten teacher, and we have netbooks in our classrooms currently. And I think what really excited me about what you were saying was the joint engagement. And I wondered if there are any discussions, from a teacher perspective. We've had many discussions as a staff about this, because there seems a fine line between a child just being occupied when they're working alone on the computer versus truly being engaged in the learning process. And I wondered if there were any discussions around that. And also, I'm just interested to know how receptive preschool teachers have been about having technology in their classrooms.
Right. So I'll take your first question and then your second. So I would say that I don't know where those discussions would happen, but I think one of the things I was emphasizing a little bit earlier is that we need to sort of leverage research and higher education opportunities in pre-service to try to actually give teachers a sense of how to evaluate the learning potential of those technologies. There's just so much out there, and so to have a filter or a lens for thinking about, does this really allow for joint or support joint media engagement, and is there a sequence? So that's one of the things I look for, is this just a one-off app that you could play over and over again, but it doesn't really develop or go anywhere or take the child somewhere if they play more and learn? So that's one of those criteria that I think we need to give preschool teachers, both prior to getting into the classroom, but in the classroom as well and in service. So giving them some lenses to think with and make judgments and evaluate. Because there won't always be those fora. And hopefully there are, as in your setting, rich professional conversations happening in the building, but we need some lenses for that. Receptivity really varies. It varies a little bit by program type, but not in the ways that you might expect. So yes, you don't get a lot of this in a Montessori, support in a Montessori model, but Reggio models have been surprisingly supportive to my mind. I think it's a very project-based, hands-on model. But part of Reggio, I think it fits, is because there's so much around digital documentation now. So you see certain models that may be a little bit more receptive than others to the work. But it really varies. So some are willing to give this a try, and a whole lot are like, how could you do this to children? Like we literally had somebody say that to us in our recruiting. So, yeah, so.
So I'm also wanting to know about accessibility. Since less than half of preschool settings have digital media of any kind.
Right.
Kind of what are maybe some projections on where the price point of a tablet or something like this drops to the place where we might see this all over?
Let me venture a conjecture that it's not price driving this, but rather the comments before, which is there's a certain, relative to other things you could do, where does technology fall in terms of where you're going to invest resources in a preschool? And I really respect that decision. So I think there are other things that I might do before technology. So I don't think it's just price point. The way that, one thing to always focus on, and Ready to Learn program is always pushing on the next new, like iPads, but not many places have iPads, right? So where is this going to go at that level? Again, so this is one of the things we did for the Ready to Learn study, was we put everything on a DVD and you could run it on the one computer that there might be. We didn't assume internet, And we also, we actually didn't, because of the views of television, we had people watch video on a computer screen, so they could be like part of the computer in a lot of cases. Now, some places, like you saw there, it wasn't an issue, but in other places it was. So, but a lot of places do have like old school video, like you can pop in a VHS in a preschool setting. So there is that capacity for video. So again, it may feel really old school, but these public media assets can be really valuable. There's a good research base behind them. It's a good place to start. And I just don't know the answer to that. I think it would have to be a change in values, not so much price point, before you see big changes in access.
Thank you all very much for your attention, your participation, and for coming out on a really lovely evening to join with us. And I especially want to thank Bill for being with us and kind of activating our brains and having us think about these ideas and being with us. So thank you.